Perfect. And thank you very much, Jordan, for that nice intro. I just want to extend a thanks to the folks at MBFI and especially Jordan for organizing this webinar. I think it's a very timely and interesting topic. And as well to David of MVP for helping us with the technical stuff on the back side. And speaking of technical stuff on the backside, I know internet connection can be a little iffy from time to time. So for the interest of bandwidth, I just wanted to kind of put a name to the face, but I'm just going to turn off my video just so we don't lose any connectivity along the way. But feel free, Jordan, if we lose video or audio connection, just to flag me down and we'll go from there. So I know we're a little bit past the typical time we're going to be doing some AI stuff for beef, but I think this is a great opportunity to evaluate if artificial insemination is a good fit for your operation and, of course, come up with a plan ahead. So maybe you're joining us because this is your first time considering AI, you're a longstanding AI user, or maybe you're just coming inside to beat the heat and a good excuse to get to the air conditioning. But hopefully we have a little bit of tidbits of information for everybody kind of going through. And if you are just there for the air conditioning, then hopefully we spark your interest in AI as well. Artificial insemination, as you know, is a wonderful management tool to increase the genetic potential of your herd. But at the heart of it, artificial insemination is all about planning, the details behind it, and it's a very time-sensitive endeavor. So I'm not an AI technician working for a genetics company. I'm not a researcher that's an academic in the repro side. But what I've had the opportunity to do is do AI on different operations, so beef and dairy with different equipment, as well as work with some beef producers that were new to AI. So I've addressed some of these common questions and I guess you'd call them surprises that kind of come up along the way when you're first starting out. So that's what this presentation is going to be about, is giving you some practical tips and avoiding that, oh geez, I wish I would have been told that. I wish I would have been told that ahead of time before I did that moments that can sometimes pop up with AI. So how we're going to do that today is by going through some considerations that can impact your success, particularly in your first year. So at the herd level, we'll discuss some stuff about equipment and as well as some time commitments that might come up along the way. Of course, we have to talk a little bit about the physiology, about how these hormones are going to work, but more importantly, why they might not work in some circumstances altogether. We'll go through a couple example AI protocols just so you have an idea of how to evaluate which one might be a best fit on your operation. And we'll finish off with what we can expect for results if we do AI in the next year or so in a comparison for some of the different protocols. So starting off, it's hard to think about now, but imagine that the snow is starting to melt in the spring. You're in the middle of next year's calving season. What are you going to be doing at that time? You might be seeding. You might be having another on-farm job. But at the end of the day, AI actually is a pretty big time investment. And oftentimes we kind of think about it as a one-day deal, but depending on what you're doing, it can actually, the amount of time that you have in the spring is going to dictate maybe which protocol that you're going to be using and how your scheduling is going to work out. The next consideration, and I know we're kind of jumping ahead here with the PowerPoint, and as a vet, I've been to a few different operations, and there's definitely a spectrum out there for facilities for handling beef cattle. Most of us on the call here are probably somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. Maybe not having a hydraulic Cadillac squeeze or silencer squeeze, sorry. Maybe not necessarily that tree in the field. I know for myself, I'm maybe a little closer to the tree than I'd like. And it's not that you need anything expensive or fancy to do AI, but the reason why facilities are so important when it comes to artificial insemination is we have to be able to handle these cattle at a low stress. That's because stressed animals are going to have a less response to our protocols and have a less chance of getting bred compared to animals that are handled in a low stress manner. Are these cattle going to be easily accessible? Are you able to sort them into the different groups that you're going to be doing? If you have to breed them in the next day, can you reliably get that animal up when you need to? And depending on your protocol that you're choosing to do, you may be running these animals through the chute multiple times, maybe 3, 4 times, maybe more if you're going to be vaccinating pre-breeding. And by that time you get to the 4th or 5th time, I can tell you that those cattle do not want to go through the chute easily. And this all matters because the timing of the AI protocols we use are very specific. And sometimes it's down to the few hours, narrow hours of that window that they can be bred. So I know for me, as a producer, this is a limiting step that I have. I mean, I know how to do the AI really well. The protocols I'm very comfortable with, but even though I can get them into a half decent chute, it's the getting them into the chute that's certainly the issue there. So it might just be meaning that you need to readjust some of the facilities that you have to get those animals in a little easier, investing maybe a little bit more into facilities before you invest into the AI, or this is going to be the bottleneck here and be a limited amount of animals that you can do reliably in a group when you're using different protocols. So facilities is just one thing, but we can get a little bit more specific when we start talking about in terms of the AI equipment that you're going to be using. AI equipment is pretty simple and standard, but there might be a few different ways that you get a hold of some of this equipment. You can borrow from a friend, you can purchase it used or inherit it maybe from a neighbor that's not interested in doing it anymore, or you can get it from a genetics company that would be probably more than willing to help you talk about the different equipment that's out there now. But I wanted to go over some tips and point out a few things that I've kind of learned along the way that might help you out. So the first one would be the actual semen tank where you're storing the frozen semen. If it's your first year, or maybe this is something that you're just kind of interested in dabbling in it, rather than going out investing in a tank, run it by your vet clinic to see if there's a possibility that you can use their tank to store a few canes or straws of semen in the meantime while you're deciding if it's something that you want to pursue long term. When you have this tank, there's always the issue of maintaining the liquid nitrogen and having the proper storage conditions. And something that I found out after the fact, and I kind of wish I knew a little bit ahead of time, is when I was transporting some of these tanks back and forth to producer's operation, I didn't realize that the liquid nitrogen in there and the way that's kind of exhausted in these tanks actually consumes oxygen in a confined area. So not a bad idea to have your windows open when you're driving with these tanks, just to have that kind of in the back of your mind. It does consume the oxygen a little bit. When it comes to choosing the different AI rods, there's a few different types and styles that are available. And the one that I'm the most familiar with using is the one that you see in the middle here, the spiral one. And it's not to say that the other ones aren't going to work or anything like that, but just know that there is a few differences out there. That one, that O-ring, one that has that little donut looking thing that can slide up and down, is just another way of having that sheath fit onto the AI rod. And this is going to depend, because some of these sheets that you're going to purchase are more suitable for one AI rod compared to some of the other ones. The other thing that I kind of learned a little bit the hard way, and this comes down to when you're I guess, borrowing equipment or maybe using equipment for the first time. Back in the day, they used to have some of these AI rods that were only usable for 1/4 cc or half cc straw sizes, because AI semen comes in a couple different sizes there. So it really sucks when you have that cow ready to go in the chute and you go to load up that AI gun and find out the semen that you either ordered or the gun that you ordered is a mismatched fit. And again, this is a little bit of a time sensitivity thing. Once you've thawed that straw, you only have so much time with it. The guns that you can purchase nowadays, they're universal. You can use 1/4 cc and half cc straws. But just as an FYI, if you are getting some used stuff, just always double check that they're going to be compatible with each other. In terms of a few other things that you're going to need along the way, you need some sort of a water bath that's going to help thaw that straw for you, which means that you're going to need a power source by your chute. So if you're AIing some of these animals in a remote location, or you don't have anything accessible for an electric power source, just at least at a minimum, have something that you could plug into your truck or something like that, just to make sure that there is some sort of power source available. One of the other things that I ran into as well is sometimes these things can malfunction, and that's why they'll often come with these little strips that you can put in there and determine exactly what the temperature is of that water bath, because anything that's going to be kind of outside that recommended range for thawing semen is going to impact what your conception rates are when you're doing the protocols. So just a little note there. And this one might seem a little bit basic, but even the details down to the sleeves. So when you're first starting out, it can feel like you're, they call it rectal tourism when you're trying to figure out what's going on when you're palpating some of these animals and kind of learning the anatomy. And I know for myself and a lot of other people, they find some of these sleeves a little clunky. There's a lot of plastic there. Throwing some exam gloves, like those tight exam gloves over top, can just make it a little bit easier for you to kind of maneuver that repro track, especially when you're first learning. The other thing too, some of these sleeves actually come with a plastic extension on them that can go around your neck, so they're not constantly sliding down and causing you a little bit more issues than need be. I've asked my colleagues their kind of opinion on this too when it comes to using the different lubes out there. My preference is to source out and use non-spermicidal lube. Again, you're using it to make it a little easier to get your hand into the rectum so you can do the AI stuff. So typically it's not an issue for spermicidal effect there. It's just more if that AI rod comes in contact with the lube or whatever, you don't want to be throwing anything off there. But many of my colleagues also just use your general lube. So I guess it's really dependent on how comfortable you feel with that, how risk averse. But just so you know, there is a few different types of lubricants that you can use out there. You've probably seen this device kicking around, even if you haven't used it for AI. And this is actually the part once you go to load the semen straw into the gun that you use to snip off the top of that semen straw so you can actually administer it into the cow. So it's a little plastic device, it's spring loaded. And what I've had happen a couple times now is the spring either comes off of that or for whatever reason, then you're really kind of hooped trying to get that straw into the cow. So I always recommend having a backup set of scissors with you, because you don't want to be touching those thawed semen straws any more than you have to, preferably not at all, because your jackknife or knife in your pocket's just not going to quite cut it for that. So just as an FYI, having an extra pair of scissors can be quite a lifesaver when you have a bunch of cows lined up to do some AI in the chute. So that's some things to think about in terms of facilities and equipment, but what about the cows themselves? So from a herd management perspective, one of the biggest ones is what body condition score your cows are in at the time of breeding. So in Canada, we measure body condition score out of 5. And this picture I've taken from the BCRC website shows a cow that's 2, maybe less than 2 for body condition score. And this is going to impact repro rates a lot. And that's because when cows are at a body condition score of 2, or heifers, I would say even a 2.5 or less, they're not going to be good candidates for AI, and you might even just natural service have reduced rates. This could be a year-to-year problem that maybe you're dealing with, and it might just be a matter of adjusting your feeding program. So either consulting your vet, a nutritionist, and try to kind of get them into that body condition score that's going to be more close to ideal. Or maybe it's just a one-off sort of thing, like a really tough year that you just decide, you know what, AI might not be the best decision for this group. I'm going to postpone it to the year after, just because your rates might be a little lower than expected. So a cow that is featured here, that's an ideal body condition score of 3, is going to rebreed up to 30 days sooner. These pregnancies are more likely to stick. And because we're AIing for genetic potential, dams with a reduced body condition score are not going to be milking as good, say from year to year, and they're not going to be able to have that calf reach to that genetic potential that we're searching for. So maybe some of these are kind of a high level consideration, but let's start looking at some of our options for protocols and for physiology. So when you start looking at some of the options for AI protocols out there, it can be quite overwhelming with different options available to you. And you might be asking yourself, well, which one is actually better? So the way I like to break it down is kind of look at things a little simpler. On one side, you have your basic heat detection, and that's no manipulation of the estrous cycle using hormones or anything like that. On to the other side, you have something called fixed time AI, which you're manipulating that estrous cycle using hormones. And there's a lot of protocols out there that aren't mutually exclusive. They use combinations of these heat detection and some sort of a timed AI hormone protocol. But an important distinction I'm going to make here for synchronization protocols is when you're synchronizing heats, you're synchronizing the behavior, that standing heat. So there's some protocols that do that really well, but it's the actual behavior, the observed behavior that you're syncing. Fixed time AI is going to synchronize the actual ovulation event. You may or may not actually see heats associated with this, but the way that the hormones are set up, that ovulation event is going to be what's synced. And that's a pretty important distinction there. So let's start with just talking about the most basic heat detection with no use of hormones at all. So this can be pretty time consuming. It's pretty common to do in the beef AI stuff. There's lots of observation. And if you're essentially waiting for that cow or heifer to kind of show that cardinal sign of heat, which is standing to be mounted. You'll read a little bit about this AM/PM rule. And what that's saying is if you see that animal in standing heat in the morning, you're going to want to breed her in the afternoon, or vice versa. If you see her in standing heat in the evening, you're going to want to breed her the following morning. Where things get a little tricky with this is when you see those animals come into heat mid-afternoon, and then you're faced with that decision. Well, should I breed her sooner or should I wait a little bit later? In my opinion, breeding those animals that evening, kind of as late as you can kind of push it out to, is probably the way to go. Because if you wait for too long for that time to elapse, you've kind of missed that whole moment, and you got to wait for that whole cycle to go through again. So those mid-afternoon ones are a little bit of a judgment call, but in my opinion, going sooner than later, you're going to have better results. So if heat detection is kind of new for you, I mean, obviously we're looking for cows that are in heat just to make sure that they're maybe not open. But if actually looking for heats for AI is something new, what I'd recommend even this year or even the beginning of next year is really get into the habit of writing down cows that come into heat even before you're starting to AI. So not only do you get practice doing that, but you also get an idea where they are in their cycle, because then you know a few weeks later when they're most likely to come into heat again, and you can kind of start to follow some patterns that way. There's various aids out there. The ones I have featured here are the KMAR patches. These just kind of glue on. There's a bunch of variations on a theme that help you detect estrus if you're not able to be out in the field all the time. A lot of this comes down to preference of what producers like to use, but keep in mind it is another trip through the chute that these animals have to have these aids put on them, right? So when it comes down to basic heat detection, again, there's no manipulation of the use of hormones. It takes time, it takes skill to have a good eye to know what you're looking for. So, but what can we do to make our heat detection a bit more predictable, or if we want to have a narrower window for AI? We can synchronize heats. And moving up into protocol complexity, this one's still basic, but we can start using hormones to manipulate that cow's estrous cycle. And the most basic of basic, probably many of you are familiar with this, is giving one shot of prostaglandin. Also written in a lot of protocols that you'll see as PG. So you've probably heard of these before. Estromate would be probably one of the most common ones. It is the one that Merck carries in its product portfolio, but other ones too, like Lutalice, is also another common one, and there's a bunch of generic prostaglandins on the market. So what can we expect after giving a single shot of prostaglandin? And what can we expect in terms of the number of cattle cycling or the time that they're going to start cycling after you give the shot? Well, we need to understand a little bit about the cow's estrous cycle before we can answer that question. But I can tell you right now, it's not going to be 100%. And that's because PG or prostaglandin only works on a certain part of that cow's estrous cycle. So remember, cow's cycle is approximately 21 days long. And that's not really exact. It's kind of like an average between all the cows out there. Some are going to be a little longer. Some of them are going to be a little shorter. But on average, it's 21. So prostaglandin actually only works in this time between day 7 and 17 of the cow's estrous cycle. There's a little tiny structure that's on the ovary during this time called a corpus luteum, also known as CL. You'll see that written up in some of the protocols as well. And what the CL is it's something that appears after a cow's ovary has ovulated or when the egg has been released from the ovary. So prostaglandin acts to get rid of that CL quickly so that cow can come back into her and show heat and ovulate again a little bit sooner than she normally would naturally. So that's if they respond. If you're able to give that shot that happens to be between that day 7 and 17, typically what you can expect if they are going to respond is for them to come into heat 2 to 5 days after a shot of prostaglandin. And the number that I kind of throw out there for a lot of producers is about 4 days, but it typically ranges from 2 to 5 if they're going to respond. So how many of these cows are going to typically, show estrus after? Well, we're kind of missing out the ones that are from day 0 to day 6 and 18 to 21. So you're probably looking at about 60 to 70%. So the majority of the cows that are going to be in that thing. So you're not getting 100%, but you're also not getting a lower number either. So that's kind of a good rule of thumb it'll be more than half, but certainly not 100%. And it's a good, quick, easy way to start getting a more predictable estrus cycle after the compared to just doing the natural heat detection. So that's kind of the simplest way of manipulating the estrus cycle. We can get much more precise and accurate with our timing if we use more complicated protocols. And these can get quite advanced, but we first need to understand another hormone that's available to us. And that's another hormone that's called GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. Don't worry, you don't have to call it that. GnRH is just fine. Everybody will know what you're talking about. There's a few of these on the market that, again, you may or may not be familiar with. Fertical is Merck's product, but there's Bactrel, Cedar, and a few other ones out there as well. It works differently than prostaglandins because it acts on a different time in that cow's cycle compared to what the prostaglandin one did. So remember, the prostaglandin acted on that CL from day 7 to 17, but outside of that, sometimes those follicles on the ovary start to develop. So that GnRH actually is going to cause that follicle to ovulate or release the egg from the ovary. And that's why GnRH and prostaglandin as two different hormones work so well together in our protocols, is because they're essentially acting on different parts of the estrous cycle. So I just wanted to give you a few tips about some of these hormones when you're using them. Let's see if I can advance the slide here. The first one is to always check the dose. So just because you're familiar with using one might not mean that necessarily the next hormone is going to have the same dose. And the one example that really comes to my mind is if you're using estromate versus Lutelyse. So those are the same hormones, but estromate is 2 mils, whereas Lutelyse is going to be 5 mil dose. A lot of these injectable hormones are going to be, or if not all of them, are intramuscular injection. And that's because it's got to get to the muscle where there's a good blood supply and it starts acting a lot faster. And that's why they're intramuscular injections. So this is going to often determine the size of needle that you're using. And I know sometimes with a lot of our sub-Q products out there, it's great that we have them, but some people kind of start shying away from using some of these longer needle sizes. So the size of needle that I recommend using is an 18 gauge by 1.5 inch needle, just to make sure you are getting into the muscle and not just getting that hormone sub-Q. And this is another, when we're talking about injections here, another question that often comes up is, well, should I be giving these hormones still in the neck or should I be giving them in the hip? Because, you know, the hip is a lot closer to the ovaries and I want them to start working sooner than later. Well, it turns out many of these hormones that we're giving actually have to act on the brain first before they can get to the ovary, because they're essentially causing a cascade of hormone effect down the road. So actually, if you inject it into the hip, you're sometimes causing a whole longer effect for that hormone to take place if you believe that theory. But you're fine to give those intermuscular injections in the neck, just like you would any other injection. And the last one here is caution while handling. And this is mostly for people who are pregnant or thinking about becoming pregnant, because some of the hormones can have actual effects on human reproductivity as well, especially with people who are pregnant. So, okay, so that being said about some of these hormones, what if you really want to focus your time and breed everyone in a single day? So this is where we can start looking at some of the protocols out there. And when you start looking, you might come across something like this and you're thinking, holy crap, how do I decide which ones I'm gonna do? Because when you start looking, it's pretty overwhelming. You have protocols of different lengths, there's different hormone combinations. And then when you really start digging down a little deeper, there's different protocols for different classes of animals. I mean, there's one here that is special for Bos indicus cows. So if you have some, Brahma or something like that, you might want to be doing that. Maybe not a bad idea with the way that the weather conditions are right now, but and then there's cows that are protocols that are special for heifers and cows. And then the other thing you'll notice is this is going to also dictate how many times these animals have to go through the chute. So it doesn't have to be this complicated. We could start working through this by starting and going backwards. So say, for example, you have a group of 10 heifers you want to breed. And let's start looking at this hypothetical statement and work backwards. So let's just kind of take this generic goal of you want this group to start calving March 10th. So we know that just looking at the way our gestation chart is, AI has to occur June 1st. But we need to take into account the length of time our protocol that we're choosing is going to be. So for example, on that chart I just showed you with all the different ones, one of the shortest ones out there is about 10 days long. But some of them could be even over a month long, depending how fancy and complicated you want to get with it. A lot of times we kind of forget about pre-breeding vaccination. And the question often shows up, well, do I need to do the pre-vaccination before the protocol starts, or is it just the pre-breeding thing? Well, we know in typical situations, modified live vaccines need to be given 30 days pre-breeding. But because we are manipulating that estrous cycle with hormones, we actually have to give this 30 days prior to the start of the protocol. And the reason I'm saying that is because with modified live vaccines, there's certain instances where that IVR part, so that viral part, can cause that ovary to become inflamed, and that cow can actually miss the cycle altogether, and that's going to reduce your conception rates when it comes down to AI. So we often forget about that part of our planning process because we're used to talking about pre-breeding and not necessarily pre-protocol when it comes to AI. So some considerations to evaluate with which protocol is going to work best for you is you need to figure out what length of time you can dedicate to this. Again, what else are you doing in the spring for that entire month? How many times can you realistically run those cows through the chute before? I know they're going to be cranky with you, but in a timely manner, how many times can we run them through the chute? Are you going to have the labor at the time that you need to be able to run, say, a large group through? And the big thing too is having whoever you have helping kind of trained and ready to go. Even if they're administering Cedars, which we'll get into a little bit later, which hormones they're giving, just having everybody know what they need to do that day is key. And up until this point, we have been talking about the cow or the heifers. But one important point that we haven't addressed is when we start talking about AI protocols is addressing it how we're going to synchronize cows that have actually calved. So again, this requires a little bit more planning. And let's look at that same situation again, but this time instead of for heifers, let's look at it for cows. So again, we have the same calving date goal, same breeding, same protocol start, same vaccination, but in order for this whole process to work, we have to have those cows calve sometime in mid-March, certainly before April, for one, everything to kind of go back to normal. So in reality, it's a little bit more complicated than just doing your protocols for your heifers. And that's because it takes time for that uterus to get back to normal and for that cow to start cycling again. And this chart I'm going to show you here really illustrates that. And that shows the percentage of cows cycling after they've calved based on the number of days after calving. So even if they do start cycling shortly after calving, often this isn't a really good heat. I definitely wouldn't breed them off of that. They need time to have those hormones prime their repro system, and that uterus has to involute it so that it actually has a favorable environment for conception to occur again. So typically, if you're breeding cattle 50 days or less, your results are going to be quite low after they're done calving. I would typically recommend waiting for about 60 days or 2 months after calving before we start going into that. But it's not just the days after calving, it also has to do with the maturity of that animal. So in this study here, they took this a step further and broke it down by how many calves, I guess, essentially, that animal has had and how much proportion of those animals were going to cycle. So no surprise in here, first calf heifers are the toughest group to rebreed, and probably all of you know that. And that's because these first calf heifers, they are still growing. They're still figuring out that whole mothering thing, and they're probably going to be the most likely to have that reduced body condition score compared to, say, heifers that have never been bred before, as well as some of the mature cows. So knowing that first calf heifers are going to be your toughest group to have to rebreed, maybe this isn't the group that you're going to want to start with if you're wanting a little bit of a confidence boost. But as we alluded to a little bit earlier, when we're considering AI protocols with cows, what are we going to do with that existing calf that's hitting the ground and at that dam side? So these calves, they need to be sorted off when the cows are going through the cycle. This is stressful on them for sure, especially when it's happening more than once. They're in a kind of confined, close area with maybe a bunch of other calves. And so therefore you need an additional area to kind of keep them and sort them off. But this also puts them at a higher risk of disease, such as BRD or calf pneumonia pre-weaning. And there's some research out there that does show that AI management does put these calves at higher risk of getting pre-weaning pneumonia. So this is another reason why AI in cows compared to heifers can be a little bit more challenging. And it's just something to think about maybe in your first year, whether to tackle maybe heifers versus cows, because this certainly adds an additional element to the story. But what else is there is there other differences between AI and cows and heifers that we haven't necessarily talked about? Well, right now we're gonna jump into some of the example protocols out there. And the one that we're gonna consider is the 7-day co-sync. And you'll notice here that I have this protocol listed here twice, and it looks awfully similar for heifers and cows, but there is some differences here. So this is a 7-day co-sync with Cedar. This is a fixed time AI protocol. So we're syncing ovulation, and it's approximately 10 days long. These animals get run through the chute 3 times. You'll see here the hormone that we talked about, GnRH, is first put in, and along with the Cedar, which we'll get into it shortly. And then the Cedar is pulled out at 7 days, followed with a shot of prostaglandin at the same time. There's a period of time that we're going to wait before we breed those animals and give another shot of GnRH. So the differences between these protocols between heifers and cows seem small, but in terms of conception rates, it actually matters a lot. And so what I'm pointing out here is that time to when we're going to breed. So if you're having a group of heifers and cows that you're planning on AIing together, it's important to know when you're running these animals through the chute and which order they're going to be going, because this timing really does matter. So this is a typical protocol that I've recommended for producers to use kind of in their first year, mostly because it is short in duration and there's only 3 times through the chute. Again, you can use it on heifers and cows, provided that you really abide by how much time you're allotting between that last PG shot and the AI event as well. So I kind of alluded to this thing called a Cedar. If you're not familiar with it, this is how you spell Cedar. I know there's always confusion, like if people spell it like you would an air Cedar, but Cedar actually stands for a controlled internal release, drug release. It's a device that goes in vaginally and stays in the cow for 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the protocol that you're using. And it's going to release a sustained progesterone, which is the hormone that mimics that corpus luteum, that CL that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And it's put in with this little green applicator that you see here. And the one thing I'll mention about Cedars that you might want to know ahead of time is when you apply them, these little blue tails that you can see here actually stick out of the cow, which makes it a little easier to pull the Cedar out, which sounds great, except when you have a pen full of really curious animals, particularly heifers, that'll go around and start pulling out those Cedars before they're intended to, which can actually completely botch your protocol altogether. So what we often recommend doing is cutting those blue tails on the Cedars a little bit shorter, just so those animals don't go around and pull them out. So just as a little bit of a tidbit of information there is you don't want to wreck your entire protocol having those animals do that. So going back to our 7-day co-sync here, one of the other pitfalls sometimes that I see with this is we've gone through a protocol, everything's going great, we've AI'd the cow, and then we kick her out of the chute and we realize, crap, we didn't give that GnRH shot that was supposed to be given at the same time. And it's amazing how often this happens. You've turned in your 3 times through the chute into a 4 times through the chute endeavor pretty quick. So I recommend actually, as soon as you get that animal into the head gate, give her the GnRH shot first and then breed her. That way you're not forgetting anything. You're not going to harm her by giving that GnRH shot first, because it's a real pain in the butt. I guarantee you after she gets bred, she's not going to want to go back in the chute for that GnRH shot. But that is one common protocol that's out there, is the 7-day co-sync with the Cedar. Another one, and there's so many of them out there, but another one that actually just was published in 2020 by a group in Missouri at the university there, that came out pretty recently, is just something else to think about. Again, it's based on the same principles, but what the researchers found is that cows are going to have a better conception rate if they exhibit that heat behavior, even in a timed AI protocol. So their thoughts were, can we extend this protocol out and add an additional shot and have more cows demonstrate that heat behavior and get a higher conception rate altogether? So I have the 7 and 7 sync protocol, and I have the comparison one that we just talked about for the cow side. And you can see the time that Cedar is in the cow is over a 14-day compared to just the 7-day. And you have an additional prostaglandin shot right off the get-go. So this is great. You're getting more estrus behavior, but something to keep in mind is you have to run those animals through an additional time through the chute, and there's an increased amount of time for that protocol to actually work. So you're looking at 17 days versus 10 days, so that's a whole different week. And just of note, I did a comparison of the cow to cow because this protocol hasn't been tested in heifers. So they haven't evaluated to know what the conception rates or if it would actually work as well in heifers. So again, it's really important to know which protocol you're using in which class of animals. So in terms of what you're going to do after your AI and you're happy with how things worked out, what's the next step? Well, of course, we got to think about throwing the cleanup bowl with the animals that we've just AI'd, because I mean, it'd be great if we could get 100% all the time, but we certainly aren't. And then I think this is a step that often gets overlooked. And especially when we're syncing large numbers of animals, this can be a little bit of a heartbreaker that we have a lot more open rates maybe on that second cycle than we were hoping for. And that's because we've synced these animals all to be at the same time. And if we're all of a sudden throwing them out with a bull, that's a lot to expect for say one bull, or depending on how many animals you have going through for AI to realistically be able to cover. So often at preg check, the bull might get blamed for a reduced amount of pregnancy rates. But something to keep in mind is make sure you have enough bull power for the animals that you're essentially turning up with your cleanup bull, because if they all come into heat at the same time, that's a pretty tall order for what that bull can normally handle. So having an additional bull and making sure you're covered that way is really important. The next question I often get asked is, when should we think about turning the bull out now that we've AI'd these animals? And that largely stems from, we don't want that bull to breed and compete with the AI semen that we've just put into those animals, because many of them may be showing heat. Like I said, we're syncing ovulation, but maybe they're going to exhibit that heat a little bit later. And we certainly don't want it to kind of ruin the work that we just did. So general recommendation is to wait at least 1 week. And that way we're sure that those animals aren't going to be bred to the bull and compete with the AI semen and get better results that way. You certainly can go a little bit later than that if you know, for example, you're wanting to be definite with your preg checks as to which one caught to AI versus the other, if you're not planning on doing any genetic testing. But 1 week would probably be the minimum. There's definitely some wiggle room, but it's a solid recommendation. So now, putting all of this information together in terms of protocols and some of the considerations out there, what can we expect in terms of results from our AI protocols? So in general, heifers are going to have higher conception rates compared to cows. That's because they have nothing else better to do than to get bred, right? They're not raising a calf. That is their sole purpose. They should have higher conception rates. But just in general, just to know. In the literature, you're going to see a range of I guess, results from some of these timed AI protocols, and they're going to range from 30% to 65%, maybe a little higher, a little lower. And I just want you to keep in mind, these are studies that are done in ideal conditions, like everything done to a T. And there's a lot of variation out there. In my experience, I've seen rates lower than this. I've also seen rates higher than this. But this is a good rule of thumb of kind of what to expect for your AI conception rate. Sex semen is going to have lower conception rates compared to conventional semen. And I'll show you when we start comparing some of the protocols how obvious that really is. So those protocols that we just discussed, how are they going to stack up against each other? And you can do this and compare a lot of the different protocols out there. But I just did this out of the interest of the ones that we talked about today. I know we didn't talk specifically about the 5-day Cedar co-sync. We talked about the 7-day Cedar co-sync. But this one gets brought up a lot because these two protocols are very, very similar, except one's obviously 2 days shorter with an added shot. But just to give you an idea, when you're trying to decide, in the literature, the 5-day Cedar co-sync has about a 60% conception rate compared to the 7-day Cedar co-sync, which is about 55% in the cows. So you really have to decide, is that extra few percentage points worth it to run those animals through and pay for an extra shot? It really comes down to, again, what you're comfortable doing and what's going to work for you. So comparing the two protocols specifically that we talked about, the 7-day Cedar co-sync versus the 7 and 7 sync, this little chart here does it pretty good. So when they've done it with conventional semen, that 7 and 7 actually did really good. And I'd be happy with a 72% conception rate. When compared to the 7-day co-sync with Cedar, it was about 61%. And again, conventional versus sex semen, I mean, you're talking about 20% less across the board when you're comparing conventional versus sex semen. So sex semen is awesome. And I'm sure you'll have the opportunity to maybe talk to or listen to some other producers that maybe are using that in their operation. But just know that it's normal if you have below your expectation for conventional semen. It's nothing that you've done wrong there. So in conclusion, that's kind of what I had for you in terms of some of these tips and tricks for how to make your AI experience a little bit more less surprising, I guess, and avoid some of these mistakes that I know I've ran into and seen people get into, as well as maybe take home some practical ideas for success if you're going to try this out in the next year or year after. Again, I think something that we've really hammered home is it really does take planning far in advance to get this right. Work with your veterinarian to find out what products that they have available. Reach out to some of the genetics companies out there. I know there's like ABS, there's CMEX, GenX, WestGen, Alta. There's quite a few out here in Western Canada. You know, look at your schedule of events just to make sure it's all gonna work out. Your equipment's gonna work out. I recommend starting with a small group just to get your feet wet with it. Make sure everything's gonna go. It's a pretty big investment if you're gonna try to do a larger group. Definitely start small. Group of 10, 15 would be a great starting point. And hopefully I was able to show a few different systems that work, but you really need to find a system that works for your operation. And that's not going to be the same for everybody. It might take a few years of tweaking and trying different things. And of course, at the end of the day, have realistic expectations. You're not going to get 100% all the time. We'd all love that. I strive for it every time I AI for guys, but it's pretty tough. So hopefully putting some numbers to those protocols help with the realistic expectation of what you can achieve. Some resources that are available, these beef heifer AI protocols that I kind of flashed up there said was kind of overwhelming. That's through Missouri EDU. I'm gonna, I don't know if I can share my screen, but this Estro Sync website is really awesome. You actually just punch in your I guess stats for what you're looking for your herd and which protocol you're using, and it actually comes up with a calendar of events and when to give each of the hormones and stuff, just even as a double check for you. So if you're putting the Cedar in on a Thursday, you know, you take it out the following Thursday, etc. just to make sure if you are doing it and if there's other people involved, that everybody's on the same page. And of course, your veterinarian is a great resource as well, in terms of different AI protocols and obviously getting the hormones and stuff. So like I said, hopefully that helps. And if this is something that you're looking at doing, all the best of luck, and hopefully you can avoid some of those pitfalls. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jordan and turn my screen back on, and we can go through any questions if we have time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sam. That was fantastic. I know I picked up a few tips and tricks, and I'm a newbie myself to AI, and I hope everyone else was able to get some great information. If anyone has a question for Dr. Wauer, if you could please type it in the chat. Oh, we already have our first question. How much does it cost to give the 1 PG shot?
Ooh, that's a great question. And honestly, I don't have the price of, like Estromate would be our product, and I don't have the price off the top of my head. I know each clinic might be a little bit different for different pricing and stuff, but I would certainly reach out to whatever clinic that you're working with and ask what a bottle of whatever product is. So for example, if it was Estromate, and then just estimate divided by 2 ml dose, it's not going to be a whole lot. I'd say, maybe a couple bucks at the most. So don't have the specific number on it, but it's not necessarily going to break the bank on you.
Perfect. Any other questions? Oh, we have one from Mary. I have a cow that I have done the 5-day coasting. Will be AIing this evening.
Perfect. Well, that's good, Mary. Wish you luck on that. Is that the protocol that you've been using for quite some time, or is it a new one to you? And it's okay if nice.
Another question.
Oh, from Felicity there. So what's the success rate of straight heat detecting, no hormones? I would say it's going to be higher than the timed AI protocols. And a lot of it, again, comes down to your skill level of being able to, I guess, be able to detect the heat and doing really well with that. But yeah, like you're not relying on like an artificial situation with that. So your success rate, you would expect to be a bit higher than some of those timed AI protocols. You bet.
I have a question for you, Sam.
Okay.
Are any of the hormones listed better than the others?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I know I kind of threw out a few lists of different ones out there, and obviously pointed out the ones that that Merck carries, but the studies have shown that there's really no difference in terms of efficacy with these protocols using the different hormones that are available. So whatever company that your vet clinic actually works with, I would stick to what they're doing. Unless there's something that you're dead set on preference wise, but in terms of efficacy, whether you're using Lulase, Estromate, they'll be about the same. So I know we're a little bit biased towards Merck, but that's the honest truth, is they're pretty all comparable. So
great. We have a comment from someone used the 7-in-7 protocol this year and had great heat results, well worth the extra trip to the shoot. That's great.
Awesome. I'm glad to get that feedback. Like I said, I think it's a pretty new one, and yeah, it's nice to be able to give some real life examples with that. So I'm glad it worked out for you.
have another question for you. In a fixed time AI program, would you recommend breeding cows that you see in heat outside of the timed program?
Yeah, that's another really great question too, because throughout the presentation, I was really harping on, we're syncing ovulation, you might not see heats, but there's going to be some instances where not all cows are going to read the textbook in their response to some of these protocols. So if you are sure that cow is in standing heat, and I mean like really standing heat, there's no question about it. And you're comfortable and have the time to do it, I would breed her. I wouldn't say it's going to be an everyday event for sure, but sometimes you got to go with your gut feeling and kind of work with their biology as well too. So if there's the odd one that you can see that's in standing heat out using fixed time AI, I would go ahead and breed her. That's a really good question.
Do you have any other questions from anyone in attendance? Okay, I have one more last one if no one else has any more questions.
Okay.
Is there anything I can do to speed up cows cleaning after calving?
Yeah. So again, it is always a process for cows to clean after, and I kind of alluded to, that 50 to 60 days that we need to wait to rebreed her. And that's kind of in a perfect situation, right? So there's always the instances where we run into the retained placentas. Sometimes we'll see some metritis that can lead to endometritis. And endometritis is a little bit different from metritis because metritis is that really nasty, stinky, smelly thing that happens, 4 days to a week after calving, where they kind of get systemically ill. Endometritis can occur after that, where there's still kind of gross stuff in the uterus, but it's not life-threatening, but it can certainly reduce conception rates. And the dairy industry deals with this a lot. So in terms of avoiding that and dealing with that, there is a product that is called Metricure that you can actually infuse into the uterus, very much like AI, to kind of clear up that infection a little bit quicker. So in that sense, if you have some animals that you really, really want to AI, but you're not sure if they've cleaned properly and there might be a still existing infection going on there, having a vet put a ultrasound in there to see if she does have endometritis is a way to go. The other thing to avoid, like retained placentas altogether, sometimes it's easier said than done. Of course, with twins, you're going to be more likely to have a retained placenta because they calve a little bit earlier, and the detachment of that placenta doesn't always happen as fast because it's not as mature, because typically the twins are going to calve sooner. So there's not much you can do about retained placentas in that instance. But if you're having kind of a herd level retained placenta issue, more so than you would regularly expect, it can be actually related to some of the vitamins and minerals in your program. So addressing some of the nutritional components, say like vitamin E and selenium and stuff like that, making sure those levels are where they need to be can certainly help get those cows rebred a little bit faster. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but yes, we can speed up in some instances. Sometimes we just can't.
Great. That was a great answer. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm going to give kind of a last call for if anyone has any more questions or comments for Dr. Wauer, or if not, I would like to thank you, Dr. Wauer, for joining us today and giving us some excellent talk about AIing and tips and tricks. And I know I learned lots, and I hope everyone else on the call did. And thank you very much for joining us today from Saskatchewan. And hopefully next time we meet, it'll be in person.
I hope so as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone else for joining us today.
Thanks, and everybody stay cool and enjoy the rest of your summer.